The situation ultimately hinges on who bears responsibility for everything that unfolded after the drinking started. And that's where the tension between the two sides becomes the most visible. Mr. Smith feels strongly that once the altercation happened, the agreement fell apart through no fault of his own, and therefore all of his money should be returned. He sees himself as someone who entered the arrangement in good faith, paid what was asked, and got nothing but trouble in return. From his perspective, the environment he was supposed to move into became unsafe the moment things got physical. And that alone justifies not only getting his deposit back, but also being compensated for what he says was an assault. He frames the situation as a clear violation of both trust and safety, something that voided the rental agreement entirely. On the other side, Mr. Dawson's stance is almost the mirror opposite. He sees the night as a casual hangout gone wrong because of alcohol, but not a deliberate or malicious act. He argues that Mr. Smith exaggerated or even fabricated the assault claim out of anger or embarrassment, especially considering that he was also drinking and that the police ultimately chose not to file charges. In his mind, the false accusation left him dealing with unnecessary stress, police involvement, and a stain on his reputation. That's why he feels justified in filing a counterclaim. He believes he was unfairly targeted and that Mr. Smith is trying to use the legal system to recover money simply because he changed his mind about moving in. The tug-of-war between these two narratives makes the case more than just a simple deposit dispute. Each man believes he's the wronged party, and both root their arguments in the same night's events while telling the story in opposite ways. One insists he was assaulted and is owed his money. The other insists he was falsely accused and is owed damages for the drama that followed. Both rely heavily on their own version of what happened while being intoxicated, which complicates everything because memory, perception, and self-awareness don't exactly behave normally when alcohol's involved. That's especially important here because even though both admit to drinking, they can't agree on how drunk Mr. Smith was, which becomes part of the credibility battle. The fact that the entire conflict started after all three men shared an entire bottle of Jack Daniels only makes the situation messier. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, blurred boundaries, and made it easier for small disagreements or misunderstandings to explode into something bigger. Once the bottle was empty, emotions were heightened, impulses took over, and the situation escalated in a way that might not have happened if everyone had been sober. What followed was less about logic and more about reaction. And now both men are trying to frame those reactions in a way that supports their claims. All of this turns the case into a kind of moral puzzle. Who acted responsibly? Who crossed the line? And who should bear the financial consequences? Each man wants the court to validate his version of events and hold the other accountable. And that's what makes their legal confrontation the core of this final keynote. Mr. Smith's payment of $1,100 sits right at the center of the whole mess, because it represents the moment the agreement became real. Up until money exchanged hands, everything was just conversation, a Craigslist post, a visit, a handshake, understanding that a room would soon become his. But once he handed over the $100 to hold the room, and then another $1,000 on June 1st, the arrangement shifted from casual to committed. He believed he was securing a place to live, a fresh start, and some stability. To him, that payment wasn't simply a transaction. It was a promise that the space would be available, safe, and ready when he eventually moved in. He wasn't even trying to rush the process. He had more than a week before he had to leave his current place. So his plan was simple: ease into the transition, move his things slowly, and avoid stress. That money was the anchor that made all of that possible. When the drinking incident happened, the meaning of that $1,100 changed instantly. Instead of feeling like a down payment on a new chapter, it became a reminder of something that had gone wrong, something he didn't expect and didn't feel responsible for. He hadn't moved in yet, hadn't occupied the room for even a day. And suddenly, the relationship with his future landlord had blown up before he even got his first box through the door. In his mind, that means he paid for something he never received. The room was never truly his. The living arrangement never even began. And the trust necessary for such a space was destroyed on the very night they were supposed to be building comfort and familiarity. From his perspective, the logic is simple. If you pay for a service or a space that you never get to use because of the actions of the person providing it, you deserve your money back. He sees that $1,100 not as rent, but as something more like a pledge, and that pledge was broken. He didn't break it. He didn't back out. He didn't decide to cancel last minute. Something happened that made staying there impossible, something tied directly to the person he was renting from. And because he never moved in, he feels fully justified in treating that payment as refundable. But the complication, of course, is that Mr. Dawson doesn't see it that way. To him, the payment was for the room starting June 1st. Irrespective of whether Mr. Smith physically moved his belongings in. In his view, once payment was made and the date arrived, the room was officially reserved, held, and unavailable to anyone else. He believes that alone fulfills his part of the agreement. So when Mr. Smith demands the full amount back, it feels to Mr. Dawson like someone trying to reverse time on a contract that had already gone into effect. This tension, that $1,100 tied to two opposite interpretations of obligation and fairness, is what makes the second keynote so central. Money turned an informal arrangement into a binding expectation, and once the fight happened, that same money became the fuel for everything that followed. The third keynote revolves around how quickly alcohol took a simple situation and twisted it into something far more chaotic than anyone expected. What began as a casual visit to measure a room somehow turned into three men sitting together with a full bottle of Jack Daniels, passing it back and forth until the bottle was completely empty. The drinking wasn't planned, and it wasn't part of any formal agreement. It was more like an impulsive attempt at bonding or breaking the ice between a future tenant and a future landlord. But instead of building comfort, it created a perfect storm where judgments slipped, tempers blurred, and boundaries dissolved. Alcohol has this way of speeding up connections while also dismantling them, and that's exactly what happened here. Within a couple of hours, they shifted from strangers to drinking buddies to adversaries locked in a dispute neither expected. The fact that the entire bottle was polished off adds weight to the moment. It implies more than just social drinking. It suggests a level of intoxication where clarity disappears and instincts take over. Mr. Dawson openly admits he reached about a 7 out of 10 on his drunkenness scale, which paints a picture of someone well past relaxed and stepping into territory where reactions become unpredictable. Mr. Smith, on the other hand, insists he was only at a 2, claiming he had other commitments that evening and was just sipping. But even that claim doesn't erase the reality of the environment they were in. 3 men, no glasses, no mixer, sharing a bottle like longtime friends despite barely knowing each other. That type of setup creates an emotional looseness, a version of vulnerability that can quickly flip into conflict when someone says the wrong thing or misreads a tone. Alcohol doesn't just affect perception. It affects memory, and that becomes a huge part of why this fight escalated into a legal battle. 2 people remembering the same event differently is common. But 2 people remembering an event differently while drunk is almost guaranteed. What each of them believed happened that night is shaped not only by the actual moment, but also by how intoxicated they were, how threatened they felt, how defensive they became afterward, and how their personal pride filtered the experience. The neighbor's presence also adds another layer, because a third person drinking heavily in the same room can shift the dynamics instantly. If one person gets louder, the others follow. If one person feels disrespected, tensions ripple out fast. What's interesting is that the alcohol became the unspoken force driving everything that followed. Without it, Mr. Smith likely would have taken his measurements, gone home, and moved in over the next 12 days. Without it, they probably wouldn't have been sitting around sharing the bottle. And without that moment of lowered inhibitions, the disagreement might never have turned physical or confrontational. The bottle created an atmosphere where personal boundaries were too soft, where strangers acted like old friends, and where reactions became sharper than they needed to be. It took a practical situation, a rental agreement, and shoved it into emotional terrain that neither man was prepared to navigate. That's why the alcohol isn't just a detail in the story, but a pivotal turning point. It transformed a routine interaction into a volatile encounter. And once things escalated, the drinking became the lens through which every part of the conflict was viewed. Each man uses the drinking to support his own version of events, one claiming he was barely affected, the other openly admitting he was drunk, but insisting the accusations were exaggerated. And in the end, the empty bottle sits at the center of the story, symbolizing how quickly control can slip when people let down their guard in front of strangers, and how one impulsive choice can set off a chain reaction that neither side can undo. Asterisk. The fourth keynote digs into the conflicting stories each man tells and how those differences turn a messy situation into a full-blown credibility battle. Both of them walked away from the same night, the same room, the same bottle of Jack Daniels, yet somehow they ended up with completely opposite versions of what happened. That split is where all the tension lives. Each man believes his version is the accurate one, the reasonable one, the one grounded in truth. And because alcohol was flowing heavily, memory becomes slippery, reactions become exaggerated, and the line between what someone thinks happened and what actually happened blurs fast. Mr. Smith frames himself as someone who stayed mostly in control. He says he was sipping lightly, mindful of his other appointments, keeping his head clear while the others were drinking harder. In his story, he's the one trying to stay responsible while stuck in a chaotic environment. He recalls himself as the rational observer, the person aware of his surroundings, someone who could accurately remember and recount the events of the night. From his point of view, the conflict escalated because of Mr. Dawson, not because he himself lost control. He insists he wasn't drunk enough to misinterpret intentions or mistake clumsy drunken behavior for aggression. In his mind, what happened was clear. And the responsibility falls squarely on the person offering the room, Mr. Dawson. Meanwhile, leans into a different interpretation. He openly admits he was drinking heavily, but he also insists Mr. Smith was right there with him. He doesn't buy the "I was only at a 2" claim for a second. To him, the idea that someone sipping from the same bottle, in the same room, at the same pace, stayed practically sober while everyone else got drunk sounds like a stretch. In his version, Mr. Smith isn't a calm observer, he's an active participant. He believes the accusations that followed came not from clarity, but from impaired judgment, embarrassment, or anger after the night went sideways. The fact that the police didn't file charges becomes a key part of his argument. He sees that as proof that the accusations lacked substance or consistency. In his eyes, the assault claim wasn't a reflection of reality. It was an emotional reaction wrapped in alcohol and regret. This split in their stories creates a kind of narrative tug-of-war. Each man uses the same details, the bottle, the date, the conversation, the neighbor, but frames them differently to support his own argument. That's what makes the conflict feel less like a typical tenant-landlord disagreement and more like a clash of interpretations shaped by pride, memory, and defensiveness. When people are drunk, their recollections become colored by how they felt in the moment. If someone felt threatened, they'll remember it as aggression. If someone felt embarrassed, they'll remember it as provocation. If someone felt challenged, they'll remember it as disrespect. Alcohol doesn't just change behavior. It changes perception. And perception is exactly what both men are fighting over. What's even more interesting is how both rely on confidence rather than evidence. Neither side has physical proof. There's no video, no neutral witness statements, no injuries photographed. The neighbor could have been a key voice, but the transcript never gives his account. So the courtroom becomes a place where tone, attitude, and honesty matter just as much as facts. Judge Judy's reactions show this. She studies how they answer, how they carry themselves, how willing they are to admit fault or show consistency. When someone says, "I was just sipping," while participating in emptying an entire bottle, she notices the contradiction. When someone admits to being at a 7 out of 10, she notes the honesty. Credibility becomes the currency that decides everything. This keynote highlights how quickly trust disintegrates when two people tell incompatible stories about the same moment. And without shared clarity, the conflict isn't just about who's right. It's about whose memory carries more weight, whose emotions the court believes, and whose version feels closer to reality once the drinking fades. And the consequences settle in. The fifth keynote centers on how this situation evolved into a legal showdown where both men believe the other should bear the financial and emotional fallout of what happened that night. It isn't just about a deposit anymore. It's about pride, responsibility, and who the court believes. Mr. Smith insists that once the altercation happened, the entire rental agreement collapsed through no fault of his own. He sees himself as someone who entered into the arrangement respectfully. He paid the required money, followed the timeline, and even attempted to build a friendly connection by bringing a bottle of Jack Daniels to him. The moment things turned physical, the deal was dead. The trust was gone, the sense of safety was gone, and the relationship between future landlord and tenant was beyond repair. In his mind, the only reasonable outcome is for the court to restore what he lost, not just his money, but the principle that he shouldn't have to suffer consequences for someone else's misconduct. On the other side, Mr. Dawson views the situation as an unfair attack on his character. He believes the fight was influenced heavily by alcohol and mutual participation. He does not deny that tensions rose, that voices might have escalated, or that judgment was clouded. But he rejects the idea that he committed the aggressive act he's accused of. When Mr. Smith went to the police, filing assault accusations, Mr. Dawson saw it as a betrayal, something done out of frustration or panic rather than truth. The fact that the authorities didn't move forward with charges reinforces his belief that the accusations were exaggerated or fabricated. That moment in his eyes shifted him from the role of a landlord dealing with a drunk guest into someone defending himself from false claims. That's why he countersues. He feels he's suffered stress, humiliation, and legal trouble because of allegations he insists were not grounded in reality. This dual sense of victimhood is what turns the conflict into a legal tangle. Neither man is willing to take full responsibility, and each believes he's the one who endured the greater harm. Mr. Smith focuses on the financial loss and the emotional shock of a night he thought would be simple. Mr. Dawson focuses on the reputational damage and the fear of being wrongfully blamed for violence. Both positions rely on deeply personal interpretations of the same chaotic moment, shaped by alcohol-fueled memory, ego, and the instinct to defend oneself. The core problem is that neither side sees the situation as a mutual mistake or a shared lapse in judgment. Instead, both view themselves as the wronged party deserving justice. That's what makes the fifth keynote so complex. It's not about whether something happened, but about whose perspective carries more weight. The court is left to untangle two narratives born from the same night, each filtered through personal bias and blurred recollection. The legal battle becomes a reflection of how quickly relationships can crumble when trust is broken, how alcohol can turn misunderstandings into accusations, and how two people can walk away from one event with stories that feel not just different, but completely incompatible.